Hi, everybody. I'm Dave.
I'm Courtney.
We're the Counseling Geeks. Um, we're here for another video. We had just finished up a series of videos that talked about some of the things that we've been experiencing as a society lately. And we want to start another group of videos that are based around trauma. Which actually from our last videos leads right into this subject anyways. Trauma does invade, and especially today is invading a lot of our lives, and uh, we're all experiencing some level of trauma with what's going on nationwide, but we want to get a little more specific into what trauma really is on an individual basis, more so than the societal basis that we have been talking about. But trauma in and of itself, there's you know everybody has a different opinion about what trauma is, and we wanted to just jump into what does trauma mean, and I one of the things I wanted to do was to if you've ever heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, it's an actual disorder that surrounds trauma. Um, Anyways, not that everybody who experiences trauma is going to get post-traumatic stress disorder, but wanted to go through that just as an introduction to give you an idea of what trauma can be. Anyways, according in terms of mental health. So just kind of reading through the DSM-5, if for those of you who don't know, DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And basically that book is the our therapist Bible, anyways, for how we diagnose different mental conditions. And in the DSM, it describes what that disorder is and the criteria that you have to meet to get there. So this is an excerpt from the DSM-5, which 5 means the 5th edition. And so for post-traumatic stress disorder, there are criteria, A through G. And the first criteria is that the person has to be exposed to some traumatic event, such as death or threatened death or injury or violence or what have you. And this means that it's not just direct exposure, which is definitely one of the criteria, but also witnessing one of those things, or learning that somebody close to you has been involved in that, or that's happened to them, or maybe indirect exposure, meaning that you're reading about it or you're hearing about it or what have you. And Courtney and I had gotten into a discussion about, does that mean perception is part of trauma? And it certainly is. That we have a perceived threat happening to us, whether that threat may be real or not. But going down into actual symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder is, unwanted and upsetting memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress after an exposure, a physical reaction to it. Go into avoidance, where you're avoiding places or people or things, or you're avoiding the emotions that come along with that, or anything that reminds you of those things. Going a little further into you know changes in our thoughts and our mood. Uh, there's so many that can be listed here, but just to name a few, according to post-traumatic stress disorder and the DSM-5, an inability to recall key features of the trauma, overly negative thoughts or assumptions about that trauma or the world or anything related to it. Maybe a blaming of the trauma on yourself or on others or what have you. Decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, difficulty experiencing something positive from that experience. You can go into things like irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, a heightened startle reaction, difficulties concentrating or sleeping, and DSM goes a little further and says, you have to have these symptoms for at least a month, and that it's creating some sort of function or a dysfunction anyways, whether it be with your work or with your social situation or school or what have you, and that all of these symptoms not related to some other disorder anyways, or due to medication or substance use or what have you. So, I mean, that's how the DSM-5 delineates whether you have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but you can see how it outlines that there are certain things that happen to us when we're exposed to a trauma. Again, and I can't say it enough, because you have been involved in a trauma somehow, some way, does not mean that you have post-traumatic stress disorder or that you will develop it. I was just reading that just to give you an idea of what the experts in the field have said about trauma and its impact on us in a measurable kind of a way. That doesn't mean that we don't deal with trauma in all different kinds of ways. It doesn't always have to take away from our functioning completely, or what have you. And we don't have to have all those symptoms and all that. And Courtney, I don't know if you want to take over from there and
Yeah. So basically, to break this down, is thinking about trauma as any event that has happened in your life, whether you witnessed it, whether it was discussed, whether it was perceived as a threat. It's any event outside of your ability to cope with it. And that really is the basic, simplest definition that I can think of when I think about trauma, is that it hijacks your ability to cope. And so what Dave's talking about is, as a result of that, you might internally begin to experience or feel some of those symptoms. You may want to isolate your startle response. We were talking earlier about, with the 4th of July coming up, and with military vets, in doing trauma with military, this is something that we talk about, where you're at with, this upcoming holiday and, your startle response. And so, you might see things like that. You might become very quick to anger, or become very irritable, become very depressed. We tend to see people avoid or use substances to numb the feelings that come with having, this trauma that they've experienced. So these, and there's certainly other symptoms, but that's just an example of what somebody internally might experience. When we think about trauma, there's also many different types of trauma. So let me break it down. So we talk about the typical ones of, you think about natural disasters and war and combat and community violence. These things are very significant, and many people are dealing with it firsthand. The other piece of trauma and another layer is something that was maybe not, you didn't directly experience it, maybe you witnessed it, maybe you heard about it. So 9/11 is a perfect example of either whether or not you were in New York City, you were impacted. It is embedded in your brain, if you were old enough to remember when that happened, what you were doing, who you were with. It was very traumatic, as a nation, what transpired. So that's called vicarious trauma. You weren't there, but you were still, you were still impacted by it. there are what we call big traumas and little traumas. So like the war and combat, that would be considered big T trauma. Little T trauma is things that you don't really recognize that might be considered traumatic. Keep in mind from what Dave said, trauma is subjective. So depending on how you perceive it, you might feel like this was, you know, somewhat traumatizing. So if you had a minor car accident, if you've had a really negative experience, you know, with a dental procedure, these are considered little traumas. And over time, you know, having the little T can certainly manifest as symptoms just like you would see in big T trauma. So that, you know, that startle response or hypervigilance or isolation, you're going to see those things. Historical trauma, racial trauma, cultural trauma. These are all different kinds of trauma that we look at and that we think about when we think about this lens of trauma. So the definition in its simplest form is anything outside your ability to cope. And then we break it down as far as some symptoms and the different kinds of trauma that are out there. So yeah, that's essentially, you know, like what we wanted to kind of share with you in talking about this, because as me and Dave talked about earlier, I'm a trauma therapist. I can talk about this for days. I could have videos for days on trauma, because it's fascinating to do this, you know, and to kind of see how subjective it is. And when somebody has a trauma or that they perceive it, that's their truth. And so that's what we work with as far as those feelings and thoughts and perceptions, you know, to really look at how these symptoms are impacting you. You don't need to ever tell me your story, or we were talking about this earlier, as far as your narrative, your symptoms tell me everything I need to know and how to treat you. And that's really important as well too, to be aware of maybe what you're experiencing or what you're noticing and maybe somebody else who has experienced trauma and how that manifests. So your symptoms tell the story. You don't necessarily need to tell me all the details.
Well, and like we said at the beginning, is that we want to get a little more in depth with trauma, and that's what we're going to do. We want to just use this time today as an introduction. We'll get into some more detail in later videos. Certainly, if you have any questions about it, or you know, feel like we have not addressed it well, let us know. We are more than happy to, like Courtney said, we can talk about this till the cows come home. So get ready for some more videos, and send us your questions or your concerns, or and remember to like us.
Thank you,
All
guys.
right. Thank you. Bye-bye.